launch a label for qualifying funds. I'm pleased to have with me today representatives of several of these pioneering organizations in the area of just transition. They are Patricia Richter, Senior Technical Officer for Social Finance at the International Labour Organization, Margarita Calderoni, Principal Economist on Economic Inclusion for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, Alessandra Nibbio, Head of Blended Finance at Blue Orchard Finance, and Brendan Curran, Policy Fellow for Sustainable Finance at the LSE Grantham Research Institute. Each of them will speak in turn, introducing themselves and their organizations, and the groundbreaking work that they are doing in the area of just transition. Before we do that, though, I'd like to set up our polling app now and get a sense from you of how familiar you are with the concept of a just transition. So use your browser or your QR code to tell us, are you deeply engaged, moderately knowledgeable, starting to learn more about it, or a complete novice? I hope people online are doing the same exercise, because we would like to hear from you too. So we started really strong with deeply engaged, and then the the beginners started to make themselves known. Great. Well, this is good. Tells us a lot. So many of you in the audience are starting to learn more about it, or have reached a moderate level of knowledge, and then some of you are going to ask really difficult questions afterwards, the deeply engaged. Great, I think that tells us what we need to know. Thank you very much for that. By way of an overview of the topic of the just transition, let's start, Brendan, with you, shall we?
Good afternoon, everyone. As Jamie said, my name is Brendan Curran. I work at the LSE, at the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, and hopefully I'm going to help all those who are not deeply engaged get a little bit more up to speed with the just transition. So for many in this room will know, the just transition is required because climate change is an act of brutal injustice, and the impacts of climate change will not be felt uniformly across the globe and across different groups of individuals. And so through the just transition, we can start to take a more encompassing approach to the transition to net zero and our approach to climate change, incorporating the several SDGs, including gender equality, decent work, reduced inequality, as well as poverty eradication. So we've been working in the LSE for a number of years on increasing the awareness of the need for a just transition. And what do we really mean by it? I think particularly we're speaking about connecting the green and the social, very much if we think about the E and the S in ESG. And at an economy level, I think taking into consideration the social risks and opportunities is essential if we want to de-risk the transition to net zero. Otherwise, we risk it being inefficient delivery or not delivery at all of net zero. And this has a special priority for the Global South, where as economies in the Global South try to grow, are attempting to grow, they can benefit from clean and cheaper technologies and energy, but also in a way that maintains high social standards and labour standards. And this imperative has increased in this year as we've seen an even greater need to move away from reliance on fossil fuels, as they are not only unsustainable on a carbon emissions front, but also on our reliance on autocratic regimes in which we source them. So, in terms of single-line definitions, this was first really recognized in international agreements in the Paris Agreement in 2015. And the ILO, and great to have Patricia here, have set out fantastic principles which outline what we mean by a just transition. But essentially what we're talking about is how we manage the transition to a sustainable economy in a way that benefits all and eradicates poverty and reduces existing inequalities. And what does that mean if we do it well? If managed well, we can boost unemployment. We can boost employment, not unemployment. That would be disappointing. But we can boost employment, reduce inequality, but also revive communities, as well as boosting social co-benefits like health and reducing the catastrophic effects of climate change. But if it's poorly managed and we don't take that social lens on the transition to net zero, we risk not only stranded assets, but also stranded communities and even stranded countries and workers. So we've seen the risks of a just transition, or of not taking consideration of the people when developing net zero or climate policy. Always good to put up Donald Trump, I think, to emphasize the risk of populism. But also, I think, very pertinently, the introduction of fuel taxes in France saw quite vehement protests from the Gilets Jaunes movement. And I think this quote really sums up the kind of divergence in views in terms of what is needed from climate policy. But we are seeing greater adoption within policy from the EU, and also I think the idea of a just transition in terms of good-paying jobs is very much central to President Biden's view of a net zero transition. And the COP26 was a real zeitgeist moment for the just transition, as awareness was much more mainstream, not just with governments, but also leadership from business as well as finance through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So that's a little bit about how it has grown, but I guess what are we dealing with in terms of the just transition? We try to think about it from the LSE in terms, we frame it out through four main impacted groups. Firstly being workers, that's quite an obvious one. How do we help those workers to transition to new economy or into new jobs? How do we help them to reskilling, early retirement if there's managed phase out of assets? But also, how do we support supply chains? SMEs, benefits of the transition are felt by consumers, but also they're not detrimented. It's not to their detriment as we transition. And we like to think about this through three main factors, which have their basis within the ILO principles, but essentially embedding it within existing human rights and labour standards, like the ILO principles, but also the OEC guidance for multinational enterprise. We've got to emphasize those social risks and opportunities of the net zero transition, but also finally, dialogue and participation, a social dialogue and participation is a key tenet to a just transition. So within the UK, we've been working through something called the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, or the FAHIDA, which is, often the Professor Nick Robbins does a poor spicy food joke there, but I'm going to stay away from it. But we've been working with over 50 organizations to help them think about what is the role of the investor within driving a just transition, including the Impact Investing Institute. And we have been trying to think about, first and foremost, what is the rationale for investor action? And we think about it in kind of three main steps, which is, number one, it's the right thing to do, in the sense that it's applying existing labour and human rights and delivering a positive social benefit. It's the necessary thing to do in terms of bringing people, workers, communities, but also ourselves and everyone, bringing them as part of the transition and giving them an ownership of the transition. But also, it's the smart thing to do in terms of developing the necessary and needed labour and human capital that we need to deliver a successful net zero economy. And also, finally, we're seeing emerging recognition that it is a key tenet of the consideration of fiduciary duty. And we can discuss that maybe more in the session or not. So we're seeing increasing work in terms of how do we actually quantify that from an investor point of view. Climate Action 100 Plus has a just transition indicator. The World Benchmarking Alliance analysed over 180 energy companies. The scoring wasn't particularly good, which maybe demonstrates that there's still a lot of progress to be made in terms of workers' rights, but also in what energy companies and corporates can do to transition in a way that is just and takes consideration of human and labour rights. So one final thought, and hopefully I've framed this out reasonably well. We'll see how the questions do and people feel a little bit more informed. But there is a massive opportunity with net zero transition plans. As I mentioned, GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is publishing its transition guidance very soon, start of November, I think. And we are also within the LSE publishing something called Making Transition Plans Just, which is another pun, but I think you get the idea that we want to help financial institutions have clear guidance on how they move from not just a commitment to social the social aspect of net zero, but also how they embed consideration of the just transition through their internal policies, their capital allocation, but also how they measure it and how they build it into their governance. But I think I'll stop there, Jamie, if that's okay. Hand back to you.
Well, I'm going to come back to you with a few questions, Brendan. First of all, I think there's some really memorable observations you've made. And I'll just say what stood out for me were a couple specific things. You said climate change as an act of injustice needing a just solution. So climate change itself is not a just event, and it needs to be rectified with a just transition. And that creates a special focus on the Global South, where obviously the impact is greatest. So that was interesting to me. I think separately you say the need to integrate climate and social issues. That seems quite fundamental, and I think people need to understand that it's very difficult now to talk about climate without social and social without climate. They're simply, that distinction, which we've maintained for a very long time, is starting to fade, I would say. I particularly like the comment from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and she says, this transition will either be working for all or it will not work at all. So if it isn't a just transition, it won't happen. And I think that means this expresses the need to bring along popular sentiment and the voting and consuming public. And that's a really interesting dimension to this. So it's not just fossil fuel workers, it's not just displaced fossil fuel workers, it's basically everybody, and it's communities globally, which I think is a really interesting dimension to this. And the Gilets jaunes were not fossil fuel workers. They were consumers of fossil fuel products. So I was also, so those are the things that really struck me, and I think those are quite fundamental to your description of the just transition. I did want to ask you about fiduciary duty, since you invited me to. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because when you say it's the smart thing to do, that says, okay, that sounds consistent with what a financial objective. When you say it's the right thing to do, financial investors aren't really that interested in the right thing to do. They're interested in the smart thing to do. So talk to me about how this makes it through the fiduciary duty screen.
So I do have to answer it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We have seen a greater recognition, and I was in the engagement session earlier on where there was fair consensus that consideration of climate issues and climate risk mitigation was very much baked into considerations of fiduciary duty. And certainly and we discussed this before, Jamie, as well, is that we're seeing a growing consensus from different investors that consider, for the reasons that you said, that if there's not a just transition, there is no transition. We need to take consideration of those social factors as well. There is some research. We work with the local authority pension fund forum in the UK, who have recognized that from their members, and they have quite significant assets under management, that if they don't take consideration of the social risks in the climate transition, then they aren't doing their fiduciary duty. We've also seen research from the Australian superannuation funds, similarly in that pension fund space, recognizing that it is something that they recognize as part of their fiduciary duty. And I think it is, as you rightly say, I can make the moral case as much as we want for a just transition, but we have to embed it within language and requirements that the investment community recognizes. Otherwise, we're not going to reach that mainstream action that we need.
That's great. Very, very interesting. It opens up a very interesting area, and I think it's intriguing if you can get people aligned from a fiduciary duty standpoint. I think this opens up all kinds of potential. So that's a very, very interesting area. Just quickly, any examples of investors who've been successful in integrating just transition into their strategies that you'd like to mention, other than these three?
Of course.
Who will speak for themselves?
Yeah, no, and I know I always actually use the EBRD as a very good example, but I won't this time. Yeah, I think we did a lot of work last year on a piece of research called From the Grand to the Granular. So it's a name check again for the LSE research, but essentially it was a set of expectations for investors that they could apply in their engagement and their stewardship engagement with different sectors to get them to embed consideration of the just transition. And we actually in quite a nice way, got to move beyond research and work through one of our partners in the alliance that I showed up there, Royal London Asset Management, and they actually applied that framework to their energy utility portfolio. And an even nicer part of that was that it actually resulted in several of those energy utilities publishing just transition strategies, like SSE is the example I always point to, and I think Centrica as well. So I think that is always the marquee example I use. I think engagement is a massive lever to do this. They also have used that engagement lever to encourage greater action from banks, which is a little bit awkward in the alliance because one of the investors is engaging with the banks in our alliance at times. But trying to drive that action through engagement is a crucial lever.
That's great. That's great to have those examples. But we're going to get a few more examples, I think. So we're going to move on to how people have been integrating a just transition approach in their organizations. And I'd like to start, Patricia, with you at the International Labour Organization. So the ILO is a specialized UN agency. So it'd be great to hear from you how an international organization like the ILO can play a role in integrating just transition. Talk to us a bit about that.
Thanks, Jamie, and hello, good afternoon to everyone in the room, also online. It's actually quite nice to be here in this panel of investors, of researchers, as a representative of an international organization. I think this is not the typical setup that we have, and I appreciate very much this opportunity to be here. And thanks, Jamie, for the very nice introduction to Just Transition. Normally that would be our part to do, so this is great having a researcher actually do it, so I can focus on other things. A specialized UN agency and international agency, what do they really do? Huh? That's often what we ask ourselves. Well, they burn public monies by paying people. Well, that's maybe one thing, but what do they do with that money? For the ILO, the tasks that we actually have is, the first one is we convene the governments, the workers, and the employers. And as you could hear from Brandon's introduction, this is exactly what we are actually talking about when we talk about the just transition. So we convene them. Why do we convene those people? Because we need a set of standards, in our case, labor standards that everybody agrees on are relevant, implementable. So that is the other task. We set the standards and we disseminate these standards. Well, we could stop there. As a normative organization, you would think, all good, but that's not the full story, because how do you implement these standards? It's also not enough if governments then ratify standards. Governments and the private sector, they need guidance on how to actually implement. And especially in the conversation of the just transition related to labor standards, occupational safety and health, name it, this needs guidance. And that is why an organization like the ILO then does the next step, does research, builds tools, builds capacity of people, of organizations in both public and private sphere to actually be able to implement these standards. So that's a bit of a broader frame, which is very different compared to investors. As an international organization, we do not invest money. We do not take that risk, the financial risk. We do something else. But together, we can kind of get the world go round. The ILO is a pretty old organization. I know I have gray hair, but not as gray as the ILO, maybe. The ILO is more than 100 years old, and perhaps we can compare with the times. The ILO was founded after the First World War, really crazy times, and founded on the belief that to achieve social justice, we need lasting peace. And perhaps I just leave that thought here when we look around the world that we have today. As part of these founding years, what the ILO was supposed to do already was actually analyze financial policies in view of social justice. So it is not something that just came along, the development of other international organizations or the Bretton Woods system, no. That task was with the ILO already early on, because finance was perceived as one of the main drivers of course, enterprise growth and where are jobs created, of course, in enterprises. For about 30 years, we have a program that deals directly with the financial sector called social finance. This is the one that I work for. So if you would ask me any very detailed technical question on just transition that is more labor related, I might not even be able to answer to you, because I typically work really solely with the financial sector. We work with the insurance sector, we work with the investment sector, and we also work with the financial inclusion sector. Across all levels. So we work with the regulatory level across these three themes, with support organizations, training institutes, and actual financial service providers. I did a bit of a longer excursus here because this last level is where we hear about the challenges that are out there. There have been banks out there that say, well, we have these stranded assets here. What can we do? Well, and at first we thought, okay, we pull out our Just Transition Guidelines because it's a very good document. But then we very quickly realized for a financial institution, for an investor, it's not so super practical. We need to go down to what does this mean for somebody who's actually taking financial risk.
Can you talk to us a little bit about measurement? So where does measurement fit in this? As you set standards and guidance, talk to us a little bit about measurement.
Okay, for the measurement, I will get there in a second. If you give me 30 seconds. Measurement is super important. And perhaps I skip a bit here what I have and I go straight to something else. So how can we provide guidance that is practical for investors, for banks? Thinking or leaning a bit back, what are we actually faced with here when we talk of the just transition? I am of the opinion that we are really faced with a societal change management process. This is what it is. The difference to other change management processes maybe that we are used to be dealing with in our organizations is that there are no shortcuts. We cannot rest in kind of a denial stage and resist and then move on to something else, because it affects, as Jamie said, it affects everybody. So we have to deal with it. We need to overcome this denial and resistance stage, and we need to see opportunities that it actually provides. I see this conference and the panel here as exactly that. There are the opportunities out there in just transition finance, investing in a just transition to create measurable positive outcomes for all involved, for the society as a whole, and the society includes the enterprises, includes the workers, includes the suppliers and the supply chains, and includes the communities and the consumers.
Can I ask you about that? Because the ILO, I think of the ILO as having invented the concept of just transition back in the 70s. When, I'm thinking of this as, I may get this entirely wrong, you'll correct me, but I think of this when environmental legislation in the US started to displace workers. That's where the ILO started to talk about just transition to deal with displaced workers. But from your description, you've got a much broader sense of what just transition is. It's not solely about displaced workers. Of course, it's about workers, but you've just said it's the supply chain, it's the communities, and it ends up coming back to your founding concept of social justice. And I just find that fascinating. Was that an evolution in the ILO, or has the ILO always sort of been in that space?
That's a very nice comparison that you are making there, Jamie, and I like it and I kind of take it on board. But back to the Just Transition Guidelines, I think this is where also for the finance sector, the conversation then starts, and also the link to this conference. Because of this focus on the E in the sustainable finance conversation, and for the Just Transition Guidelines, this is also the anchor point there, the move towards an environmentally sustainable society. where we cannot disconnect the E from the S. And I think this is the driving force of the conversation today. And I do like to bring up this example. When we talk about the S, it is an integral part. When we talk about the S in finance in general, and compare it to a financial analysis, well, even with investments, we can lose a bit here and we can gain a bit there, and on balance, it's hopefully positive, but we can't afford to do that with society. We cannot average out fatal accidents on this side with a little bit of income gain on another side. It just doesn't work as a society. We won't arrive there in this change management process at the end together. And this is the aim, moving towards an environmentally sustainable society, taking everybody on board. The measurement, you asked me about the measurement. If I still have time to quickly...
Please.
Okay, thank you. Measurement is important. But I also want to add, measurement is not what is creating change. The change is created by the actions, by our activities. The change is created by the investments themselves and how the investments are being perceived. And this starts off with a process in any investing activity. First, you need to have your policies, even starting somewhere else, you need to have your objective very clearly outlined. Only once this is in place, you can then start drafting your policies, your procedures, aligning responsibilities, and defining measurement frameworks with KPIs, but also with outcome and impact indicators. You hear that I am making a difference there between KPIs, outcome, and impact indicators. They work at different levels. And then you can measure the result of your actions. And the measurement helps to see are we on track or not. Yeah. But alone, it doesn't help. I do want to add, we do not need to reinvent the wheel. There is a lot out there in terms of indicators. Last year and the year before, we have worked with the Global Impact Investing Network. And I mention it here because the title is Investing. Together, I think we had about 100 investors, including the investors on stage, in the working group to elaborate impact investing strategies for quality jobs, and coming up with the metrics and the theory of change. And at the end, it was 5 strategies defined with the metric set behind, all launched, and it's out there to be used. Why didn't you do this for Just Transition? Well, we can simply use it, because Just Transition is this change process in which we can use what is out there. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to know where to go to pick up the work already done. And by that, it becomes less overwhelming, perhaps.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to now go to a practitioner who's sort of closer to the field. So Alessandra, talk to us. Can we cue the slide, please? Talk to us about what you are doing at Blue Orchard.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. And I don't know if you can see the slide.
Oh, I think you have to. I think you have to press something.
I did. Okay, good. So good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Alessandra Nibbio. I'm heading the blended finance team at Blue Orchard. So maybe I'll start just saying a few words about.
Sorry. Do you mind just defining blended finance, if you would?
I think that's already a good idea where to start. So blended finance is. Every time, let's say, that you have a mechanism where there is a private-public partnership. Let's put it simple in this way. So we work with the public sector and the private sector. We are an impact asset manager. And so I'm, in my role and within the team, I'm involved every time that there is the setup of a new strategy that involves public investors and private investors. And I'll come to an example in a second. So I also wanted to thank from my side for for being here today, representing somehow the private sector among the panelists. So Blue Orchard is, as I was saying, an impact asset manager, and we started more than 20 years ago. We started with financial inclusion and mainly microfinance. And so if you want, in the context of the just transition, for us, tackling inequalities has always been part of our strategy. And since we started, we actually enlarged our outreach in terms of asset classes, but also impact themes. And so we ended up also working on climate finance initiatives, right? And in this respect, for us, the combination of the social angle and the climate angle has been an easy answer. It's something that for us was somehow obvious. But I think it's important to add the third pillar that we were mentioning before, that is the engagement of the communities, right? The engagement of all the stakeholders. And so I think that if we would ask you to vote now about your understanding of just transition after the colleagues set the stage, you would say, okay, now I kind of understand what we are talking about. And so I want to try to build on what was said and bring this practical example. So I'll try to be, okay, good, easier than expected. So there is this initiative in particular, as I was saying, we started from microfinance, and today we have different initiatives that are tackling climate change. So it's both towards climate mitigation action, but in particular this one is towards climate adaptation. And maybe before I enter into the example itself, I'll also comment a bit on the difference between mitigation and adaptation. So I start saying that most of the initiatives that you see out there that are tackling climate change are towards mitigation. This is the vast majority, which is, it's a good thing, so I'm not saying that negatively. But those are, for example, renewable efficiency projects. And those are, let's say, towards reducing emissions, right? But that's only one part of what we need to do to get to net zero, right? So the adaptation part, it's really like adjusting to the climate change. So what we can do to kind of protect us, right? And we know that when we speak about climate change and severe weather events, the majority of the population that is most affected is in emerging and frontier markets. So Blue Orchard expertise is actually in those markets. And so what we said is like, okay, let's try to find an innovative way to help these SMEs, but also smallholder farmers to be protected, because as you can expect, when it comes to the household income, the majority of them, they really count on their crops or their cattle, so they really need to be able to count on them, and if something happens, to still being able to survive. So if we look into this specific product, so I want to go back to the three pillars, right? So we said just transition has three different ones. So one is climate, one is social, and one is engagement, right? So in this respect, we try to combine these three together within this product. This is an investment strategy that provides debt and equity to financial institutions, but also alongside the value chain of insurances, to, for example, to insurance companies themselves, but also to tech companies, right? Because, of course, innovation is very relevant in the context of climate adaptation. And doing so, we also have the support of grant capital that is provided for capacity building. And this capital, it's what contributes somehow to the engagement part, right? Because with the investment itself, you contribute to the climate adaptation topic, measuring the impact that you have to end beneficiaries, to end clients of these products. You tackle the social side, but then you kind of miss the engagement. And to try to capture that, what we have done is, thanks to this capacity building capital, is to, for example, run end client surveys, right? So, because again, I mean, you can expect an insurance product to be maybe easy, but when it comes to a climate insurance product, it sounds a bit new. So you need to always make sure that the end beneficiaries and those that are really ending up using the products are happy with that. That is something that is really changing their lives. And so that's what we did, right? So if we look at the strategy itself, it has a very difficult name to pronounce, so I'll try to do it correctly. The Insto Resilience Investment Fund. We had a conversation before about how to pronounce it correctly. I managed. And so I was just saying that...
Alessandra, I do think it's worth
Please.
pausing on the name, because it's quite a revealing
Yes.
name. Into insurance and resilience combining in one product.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to pronounce, but a very powerful concept. So
Totally agree.
People should pause. Don't scroll too past that name. It's a really interesting concept. Sorry.
No, that's a very good point. And again, it's because we try to actually create a market, right? Because again, insurance, it's an industry, right? It exists. But you don't necessarily see like specific products that would support local communities when it comes to protecting their crops, protecting livestock, and so on. So what we did with this investment is, for example, again, to try to invest in, when it comes to private equity, there is, for example, one investment that we made in Nigerians or insurance company, Royal Exchange. It was already like a big player in the market, but what we wanted to do, it was to invest together to try to expand their network to really like rural communities, right? So that they had the network, they had the presence, they had the product, but thanks to our investment, they could really like tailor-made the product in a way that could really support a specific target of the population. And same apply for another investment, and again, I try to give you practical example to make it as concrete as possible. Another private equity investment we made was in a company that is called SkyMed. So this is a different business model. That's why I said we invested in insurance companies, but also alongside the value chain, right? So this is a tech company. So what they do is they collect data. They collect data about weather events and crop yields. And by collecting this information, they spread the information through their network. So they have different stations in India. And as you can expect, India has a quite significant population, and a vast majority of it is composed of farmers. And these people, through their phone, they have access to this data, right? So for them, it tells them in making sure that they can have a better control of their crops. And so, these are just like two examples I had on top of my mind. But of course, in the portfolio of this product, we have other very, very interesting and valuable examples. And the idea is really just to say that, there are already concrete solutions that are surfing the just transition approach. And we are of the opinion that just transition is the only approach that can be taken when it comes to climate change and to achieve net zero. Now it's more a matter of scaling, right? So this is one product, but if we keep speaking about moving trillions, we need to speed up and try to replicate this kind of product as much as possible. And so it's really to encourage other players in the market, both public and private, to start setting up this type of investment strategies. Maybe I'll pause
So
here.
one of the ways we're trying to scale, as you know, is through the Just Transition Finance Challenge.
That's
and
correct.
Blue Orchard is a founding participant. So I'd love to hear from you, why is that an interesting project for you? Why are you a founding participant? Where do you see the value in that challenge?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a description, and then why it's
Yeah.
interesting to Blue Orchard.
And maybe just to say that we started already being part of, it wasn't called the challenge at the time, but we started together with the Schroders Group with the G7 Impact Task Force. So it's a process that started some time ago. And again, the idea from our perspective is to contribute with our expertise when it comes to investment in emerging and frontier markets, right? And what we would like to also achieve together, it's a sharing exercise, right? So it's a challenge that is composed of different institutions, right? Different organizations that can bring very different angles, and so for us it's important to share, right? Again, because we shouldn't fragment too much the opportunities. So if we want to scale again with the objective of scaling, we need to partner together. And so that we decided to participate and to be a founding member of the challenge together with Schroders, because we really think that we should try to have certain criteria that we can somehow share with different organizations and somehow have applicable to different strategies, right? So that once you claim that you have a just transition strategy, that's understandable for other organization in the industry.
Can I ask you, Alessandra? I think most people in the room have an instinct for what environmental impact is and what social impact is, but the community engagement thing is the newer one. It's the harder one. Can you describe that just a bit? Absolutely.
So again, I think I'll start with an example from the Institute Resilience Investment Fund. There, for example, on the private debt side, so as I said, we do private debt and private equity with this investment strategy. On the private debt side, we were providing private debt to a microfinance organization in Pakistan. It's called Cash. So what we did there, for example, was to run end client surveys, right? So there are different companies of consultants, and one of them is 60 Decibel, which is quite famous in the industry. And what they do is literally that they pick a sample of clients and they call them. They call them and they ask them like a very detailed questionnaire about their experience with the product. So the engagement, it should start, of course, also earlier, but then absolutely it has to be done at the end of the product realization. So you need to check if what you put on the market really had an impact, right? So this is engaging with the local community, for example. But in general, you need to engage with the stakeholders from the design of an investment strategy to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
As part of designing the investment strategy itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting. I hope it comes back I hope you are thinking of questions for us to expand this discussion, but I'd love to come back to that because I think it's really interesting. But I would like to go to Margherita. I'd like to, so let's find out more about what an international financial institution can do in the context of just transition. So talk to us about what the EBRD does in financing just transition.
With pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting panel on a key topic for us. So the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is both a multilateral development bank as well as an investment bank that really works on sound banking principles. Our region is that of Central and Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, as well as some of the MENA countries. This is a region that is really affected by high reliance on fossil fuels. In 1991, when we were established, it was the region in the world with really the highest reliance on fossil fuels because of the legacy from the central planning states on the reliance on cheap energy. Even nowadays, this reliance on fossil fuels represents 87% of primary energy supply versus a global average of 80%. So we are, the scale of the challenge is really high for us. For this reason, we have developed decades of expertise working on green investments, but also working on inclusive investments, which is my side of the expertise. And bringing together these two sides, we launched a Just Transition initiative in July of 2020 to combine our green objective with our just objectives. So the initiative has its own strategic approach that is structured around 3 pillars, which really resembles the structure that the previous speakers were also mentioning. So the first pillar focuses on the green economy transition, the idea that we need to reconvert stranded assets from a high reliance on fossil fuels to low carbon, but also reconvert and rehabilitate the land and create new investments in the green economy that can bring also employment. The second pillar focuses on supporting the workers that are affected by the decarbonization, making sure that they are supported through reskilling and redeployment initiatives, but also while addressing the underlying inequalities that the communities are going through. And the third pillar is that of engagement, but also regional economic diversification and development. We also have that aspect to combine these investments in the green economy, in the inclusive side, together with helping the communities and the regions diversify their local economy with, for example, supporting SMEs and the supply chains. As part of this, we have created a series of new inclusive approaches that really define what type of initiatives our clients could commit to. For example, this could include reskilling and redeployment programs for the workers directly affected, so the direct employees of our clients, but also those indirectly affected of the suppliers of our clients. And we tend to make sure that our clients commit to do this working together with local vocational institutes as well as employment agencies, so that these programs are really designed based on the skills needs of the local workers. This could also include upskilling of other groups. We also have to take into account intergenerational effects, that we also have to train youth in coal-reliant regions so that have the green skills to tap into the opportunities that the green economy can bring. We also introduce a gender lens, so we tend to mainstream gender into all our activities. So together with convincing our clients to commit to certain inclusive objectives, we would also help them improve their policies on human resources so that they are more gender responsive. And this is particularly relevant when we talk about just transition, since it's often with working in male-dominated industries. And of course, we also try to focus on bringing together the different stakeholders. As I was making the examples, our clients that are mostly representative of the private sector, together with local public education providers, but also across the different levels of policy engagement, from the local authorities, the municipalities, up to the national stakeholders. And on policy in particular, we focus on analytical approaches that we call just transition diagnostics that go together with action plans. So we start from an analysis of the green economy transition at the national level. What are the different scenarios and what is the timeline of those scenarios, and then trying to understand what are the effects of these different scenarios on the labor market, as well as on the other social and environmental aspects, so that we can create a clear analysis of what are the challenges and opportunities that the just transition brings in a certain country and a certain region. And then this goes together with an action plan where we give clear recommendations of what type of policy reforms we need to bring so that the opportunities can be tapped into, but also what type of investments could be suitable to support a just transition going forward. So this is the way in which we structure our thinking, and we already have a couple of concrete examples that we have already invested in. The first one was in 2020. We participated in a transition bond issued by Tauron in Poland. So this is a biggest player of the energy distribution and generation market in Poland. It's the second largest distributor and first largest generator, as well as a major employer with 26,000 workers. It's based in Silesia, a region that is highly reliant on coal. So as part of this transition bond, which amounted in a total of 225 million, we participated as anchor investor with about 25% of the bond value. And the bond was structured as a transition bond, meaning that the interest rate margin was tied to the reduction of CO2 emissions, as well as to the increases in renewable energy.
So does that make it a sustainability-linked bond? Is that what would you characterize it?
Somewhat.
Somewhat. Okay.
It didn't have, as part of the tying to the interest rate margin, the social part, but it was part of the covenants of the framework agreement between us and Tauron. And this is the part that I negotiated. So there were also specific covenants on the fact that Tauron committed to analyze the effects on its workforce of its decarbonization strategy and really take account of how many would need to be reskilled, how many could be supported through retirement or early retirement, and how many could be redeployed internally. Because being an integrated company, they also had new business areas that they were developing in distribution, asset management, and of course in renewables. So as part of their commitments, we covenanted with them that they will develop reskilling programs for the workers that will have to be redeployed within the labor market and supported through that process, as well as that the company will get involved into the territorial just transition plan that the European Union was developing and is developing in Poland. So that also they would participate into the stakeholder engagement that was ongoing so that they would know what were the needs of their suppliers, for example, but they would also get a better idea of what are the opportunities on the labor market that could be suitable for their workers. Another example, if I have time.
Actually, can I ask you?
Yes.
Do you join in with a private market asset manager like a Blue Orchard or somebody like them? So do you participate with them in some of these blended finance structures?
Yes. For example, in this case, we only participated to 25% of the bond issuance. So we tend to, one of our objectives is to bring capital mobilization. So we would be the anchor investor, the investor that does maybe more of the negotiation with a certain client, but then we tend to help them build instruments that can mobilize and leverage other type of investors, being private or
And then do you also
public.
provide concessionary finance, so risk junior debt or technical assistance to make a product possible?
Yes, definitely. That was going to be my second example. For
Go for
example,
it. Go for it.
in North Macedonia, we invested 25 million in a solar on mine product with ESM, which is the public energy utility of North Macedonia that owns about 80% of the coal production of the country. This adds strong ring fencing of the use of proceeds for the investments in photovoltaic and not in other parts of the business. And it had a structure of blended finance because 20% of it was supported by a grant from the European Union, which was part of the Western Balkans investment framework grants that we could tap into. So as part of this, apart from the grant part of the concessional part of the loan, we also had a series of commitments and covenants that we asked from ESM, and these were supported by a series of technical cooperation grants that could help them design this initiative. So this included developing a series of reskilling and retraining programs for different types of occupations, including people that need to be reskilled towards more vocational courses, as well as more technical or also entrepreneurship courses. It's also included support with the development of an equal opportunities action plan that looked at their different areas of the HR policies and practices so that they could be improved with a gender lens, but also involved support at the national level, and this was the part with heavier technical assistance, to help the core regions of North Macedonia, but also the country, develop a national reskilling strategy, as well as a decarbonization strategy that could also be integrated with each other. And of course, a stakeholder engagement, because in processes like this, you have to bring together different ministries, from the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Labor and Education, and also work with different levels, from the municipalities to the regional authorities to the national authorities, and also different types of groups, so civil society, trade unions, chamber of commerce, sectoral associations. So the cooperation was also an important part.
So Margareta, let me pause you there, because you've said something really interesting, which is, you, and you're not the only one who's talked about the kind of collaborations and partnerships that occur across this ecosystem. So I sort of wanted to ask you, I think I know the answer. Is there anything you've heard in this panel so far that you disagree with?
No, I fully...
No, any of you. And I'm guessing that, go ahead, Brenda. I'm guessing that this sounds quite familiar. You're nodding, you understand it, and it feels like there's this kind of consensus around the things that we're describing, and in particular the need for partnership, convening, getting people around the table. But what's interesting is the rest of the world isn't there yet. And I think one of the interesting things is, back to how can we raise awareness of just transition and what just transition requires. I think there's a whole world out there that hasn't quite fixed its attention yet on just transition, and I think that's one of the things that we need to start to focus on. So I'd like to ask you a question now. So you've heard us talk for an hour, and let me now pose this question. Can we have the question, please? So we'd like to know, what do you see as the... Oops, I can't read this now. What do you see as the challenges of applying a just transition approach to investment? So pull out those Slido and the QR codes and stuff, and tell us, from your perspective, what is it that's holding us back? What is it that's holding you back? What is it that's holding organizations back that are not fully embedded in this process? It'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say. I'm not sure if, did we allow them to make multiple choices? I can't remember. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Please do, if there are multiple things, because we're trying to crowdsource the insight here. And of course, some of the things that you're describing are things that we're working on. So pipeline and measurement and standards, tools, practical tools. So this is very interesting for us. Okay, I think we've got the input. So what do you make of this? So panelists, take a look at this, and what do you make of this? So number one is lack of practical tools to identify just transition investments. And then too difficult to measure, insufficient regulation or standards. Those are the big ones. And then, though, I'm totally gobsmacked, internal bandwidth and capacity is not listed. Fascinating, because I would have said that was a real struggle. But tell me what you think. Patricia.
If you allow me to go first, and we were nodding here on stage because of course we had some little prep conversation before the session. So I want to actually pick up the first one, the highest ranking one, the lack of practical tools to identify just transition interventions. I do think this resonates very well with what we hear also in our daily work, that, well, there are all these guidelines out, well, there's one guideline out there and there's research out there, but what does this mean in practice? So we fully agree, there is little out there. LSE Grantham Institute has done a bit there, PRI has also done a bit there, but we really need to go one step down, and that is practical tools. And I want to get back to what I mentioned earlier. The tools out there that do not pick up the investment process, I think, can only go that far. And this is where we see the lack. And together, actually, with Brandon's team, this is what we tried to do over the last couple of months, developing a just transition finance tool for banks and for investors that picks up exactly that process. So it really starts with what process do you need to have inside your institution? What are the policies? What are the procedures? The responsibilities, and equips that with examples, how it's done in practice. We wouldn't really say yet that it's best practice because it's an emerging field, but you can be sure to find the examples of the people on the stage in there. This tool is not ready yet, but it will be launched at COP27. And when around COP27, you check the web pages of the Grantham Institute and ILO Social Finance, you will probably find it there. I do want to add one more thing there. This is not the only tool out there. And you can see how this panel was collected. There is a lot that is out there that is not termed just transition, but that is relevant. And I really want you to look at that. The example from Alexandra about the Insur Resilience Investment Fund, yeah, I got it right, probably for the first time. There's a lot of work on insurance, and the insurance industry has, over the last years, been discovering this market, actually only discovering it, and trying to innovate there. We have worked with a lot of insurance companies on that, trying to capture their lessons. Again, you also need, and this is the grant element for innovation, you need grants, you need to accompany these processes, you need to measure what's the outcome, because then you can adjust insurance products, delivery processes, and all of that. From an organizational point that we try to bring out in training products that then can go out to national insurance institutes that can train the insurance companies there, or then also investment officers from such a fund that need to somehow figure out how can insurance help me in this just transition product here. So these are the linkages. You might not always find it under the theme of just transition, but when you go that one step further, what you actually need, then you find there are tools. It needs thinking, and this is this change in our minds probably that we need to.
It's a great observation. Brendan, what do you make of this?
Yeah, no surprises there.
No surprises. So you were predicting this whole thing. I got it completely wrong. Frankly.
I'm Mystic Meg, to be honest. But I think it's quite obvious to us when we got to be honest and essentially say, as you said, this is an emerging field of sustainable finance, and there is some examples of, I guess, best practice, but we need more. And I think from that you can then start to get to some of those other barriers, I guess, which is, how to measure multiple impacts. Seems to me a bit of a data question, right? A lack of data. Maybe it becomes, I believe financial institutions have measured multiple impacts before, so I think they could do it again, but perhaps there's not sufficient data. And maybe that's something, as you build up, there's more examples and more databases built up, it becomes easier for investors to make informed decisions across multiple impacts. And then one final point, I think, through a lot of our work, we always try to emphasize it's not just an internal process for an investor, but also almost every major investor will have a policy arm and will do policy advocacy. And I think for the third point around insufficient regulation and standards, there is always the opportunity for those well-meaning investors to get engaged in policy processes and regulation processes. And if you're really committed to a just transition, nudging those regulators and policymakers to, certainly in the UK, take more action on the just transition and make it slightly easier.
Alessandra, Margarita, any surprises here, or were you as prescient as Brendan was?
First comment is not clear enough. Just transition is 20%. I feel it's our fault. Brendan's fault.
I thought that was pretty good, actually. I thought that was pretty.
No, actually,
impressive.
I think there are two things. One that I was expecting, that is about not enough pipeline. I cannot find it again. Yeah. No, I lost it. Pipeline for just transition investment opportunity too small, 27%. I think that's precisely what we were trying to say, right? That we need to scale. We need to bring trillions to this type of transaction. And we mentioned some of the mechanisms that could help this becoming more prominent in terms of pipeline opportunities, such as blended finance mechanism, right? What worries me, honestly, it was the answer about the consensus in the organizations, right? So I think that's worrying. Difficult to get consensus in my organization on the need to invest in this way. I think this is, for me, the most worrying answer, right? Because it's important to raise awareness, right? So after this panel, I invite you to go back and be an ambassador in your own organization.
I agree. I mean, this is tremendous input for us to be thinking about, because we need to address these things. So it's fantastic to have the input, and we're grateful for that. Marguerite, any comment here?
No surprises?
No surprises. So I'm the dumb one in the room. Everybody else figured it out ahead of time.
For me either, but I can say that as part of our engagements with other MDBs, we worked on building a series of high-level common principles on just transition, which were launched last year at COP26. And it was a process that took a year, even working with other MDBs that should be at the frontier of working on sustainability and just aspects because of the different regions and specificities of the different institutions involved. It took us some time to get to a common agreement of what could be the common definition of just transition and the guiding principles that we could follow, of course, taking inspiration from the ILO as well. But that really helped to build a common narrative, and we hope that will also help trigger common investments, because as we heard, the scale of the challenge is so big that we need to work in partnership.
Okay, let me as I say, I'm really grateful for the input, but let's...
Jamie, if I could still jump in here,
let me
because
just-
I did kind of expect it, but I do disagree with one. Very,
You can't
very...
disagree with the people.
With
This is the
that
people-
is
the
true, but
people
I
speaking.
disagree with the perception here, and I want to add some more. The pipeline. The pipeline, perhaps, and it's linked that maybe we didn't do a good enough job to explain what we are talking about. So they might be very much linked, but I do think the pipeline is right in front of our doorstep. It is huge. We are not talking of one renewable energy plant, no. We are talking about a transition of the society, and that is why the pipeline is huge. And I felt very strongly that I needed to make this point. So yes, I agree, maybe we didn't explain it well. I take this also on
It's
me.
a communication issue then, isn't it?
But really, the just transition is this change of the society to a sustainable society. And this is in every single investment that you do. Are they ready to receive money? Maybe, but you are the ones who can make that change happen through governance, through jointly developing action plans. You can call them whatever. If you call them just transition action plans, or if you call them sustainability action plans, or if you call them whatever. But you can put in the milestones in there and accompany the investee companies in that process. Yes, there is an element of technical assistance. Yes, it costs money. Yes, maybe not every investor can do that, but this is where this partnership and collaboration is so important, because that's an opportunity. You can always reach out and also get the local authorities involved. There is public money out there. You just need to tap
Well, I'd like to
into
hear
it.
that. Thank you for persisting, Patricia. Not at all. No, I'm very glad to have the additional insight, the persistence and the optimism. But I do want to go to the audience here in the room. I've got some questions here online, but let's go to the room. Are there questions that people have that want to pose to the panel, or amplifications of some of the insights that you've just given us? There's a question here. Can we get a mic?
To you, hello? No. To you, Alexander. What's the additionality in that Insureliance product, right? Why wouldn't that insurance product already have been there? What made it happen? What's the blended finance element?
It sounds like many questions in one, but I'll start addressing it. So the blended finance, I start from the blended finance angle maybe. So the blended finance angle is the way we structure the product itself, right? So it's a product that to convince, let's say, to catalyze the private sector as a junior capital component in itself, right? So it's there is a de-risking mechanism that convince somehow private investors to join this fund. And this is the blended angle, I would say. On top of that, as we were mentioning before, there is this technical assistance facility that is in place, so that provides capacity building, but can also be used, for end client service, as I was mentioning. And so this is, let's say, the blended part where you put together public money and private money.
Is the public money only for the technical assistance?
No, it's also in the fund itself. So it's part of, it's a layer structure. So it's a fund with a layer structure. So you have public capital that is invested in a junior position, and then you have the private capital that comes on top, which is a very sweet deal for a private investor, right? Because maybe they wouldn't have come into the transaction, especially because, as I mentioned before, we only do emerging and frontier markets. So sometimes, investors like, I'm not sure. But thanks to this de-risking mechanism, they invested.
Who is the public body in this case?
In this case,
you're going to have to repeat the question, or
Sorry, and who is the public body in this case?
in this case, the investment was made, the sponsor of the initiative is KfW, so the German Development Bank, on behalf of the BMZ, so the German government.
Okay, thanks for the question and for the answer. While you're thinking up your next question, I'd like to go to something online. I think it's a really interesting question. How do you mean, and Alessandro, you raised this, how do you meaningfully engage communities not only at the end, but also through the holding process and the development process? And it's not necessarily a question for you, but it could be. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay,
Shall
take
I go
it.
ahead?
Take it. So how do you, yeah, go ahead, Margherita.
I guess is to really understand from an understanding of what are the needs and what are the gaps, what are the drivers of pre-existing inequalities of these communities, and making sure that any investment instrument activity is tailored to the needs of the local communities. So starting from a diagnostic to understand what are the needs and then what are the opportunities to satisfy those needs.
And how do you get at that information? So, Alessandra, you mentioned calling people, so getting on, basically doing surveys, but what are the other ways to find out what the local community needs are and how they're responding to?
I mean, it's always a matter of matching, the market demand with the investors' demand, right? So you need to have people on the ground, right? It's not that you can do it like from one day to the other. From our perspective as Blue Orchard, so we have people on the ground. So we have like many investment officers that are on the ground, that they know, their clients, and their clients being, for example, financial institutions or insurance companies. They know their clients, so it's kind of sharing information, right? So, but it's what Margherita was hinting. So you need to kind of do I don't know if you can call it feasibility study, but you need to do like working group, understanding what they need, right? And then you start implementing a product, and then you assess if the product was successful.
So it's an iterative process during the design stage.
Correct.
In which you consult with local,
Precisely,
local communities,
yeah.
Perhaps just to add on, during your due diligence, make sure that you visit the communities. Don't just stay inside the boardroom. Go out there, get your rubber boots, and get your hands dirty. Without that, you will never understand what's happening around, and you are also not able to evaluate the risk, because these communities around, they can sometimes make it go well or fail. You need them on board. There is no question around that. At latest in the due diligence, take your rubber boots and go. Another option here, and this is back to the partnerships and collaborations, there is the civil society out there that is most likely happy to actually talk to you and give you feedback. You can always use them. If you believe their feedback or not is a different story, but it's a source of information that can be very relevant for triangulating information that you are getting. So you can invest a lot of money by doing it all on your own, but you can also, by involving others who might be closer to your investment, benefit from that expertise.
Let's take a question. The most popular one from online is what are the top priorities that we need to focus on to significantly increase capital flows to a just transition? Could each of you comment on that briefly?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Yeah. So this may not be surprising given it was my last slide, but I think we need to see international recognition as much as possible about what a just transition is and what is best practice in terms of how financial institutions can embed it. And I think the main mechanism for doing that right now is to get it into the kind of we're in the first iteration of what constitutes a gold standard net zero transition plan. And it would be a real missed open goal to not take a holistic approach or understanding of sustainability, including both nature, biodiversity, but also the social risks and opportunities of the transition to net zero, and have that all encompassing within transition plans. Because if we, in doing that now, I think, rather than just focusing on carbon emissions within transition plans and in 5 years down the line realizing, we're in a serious diffs with biodiversity, social impacts, and we're not going to achieve our carbon emission goals. So I think taking that holistic approach to transition plans is a massive lever we have right now.
Margherita, what would you add to that? Top priorities.
Yes, being holistic in our approaches, I think it's very important, but also before you were talking about the consultation process so that we can engage the communities is also about being inclusive in these consultation processes and thinking about different type of stakeholders that could be and should be included, not only the workers directly affected, but the broader communities, the women, and so on. And again, for me, the main important point is also the partnerships, because in bringing and responding to the needs of different stakeholders, you also need to bring in different partners that can have different expertises and cover different aspects of the just transition challenge.
Okay, Patricia, to significantly increase capital flows, what's your recommendation?
One word. My one word is commit.
Commit.
Commit. Why? When you commit and commit publicly, you have something out there that you are responsible for, and you will be reminded by your shareholders, by other stakeholders about achieving it. And this, I think, will spark innovation that we need. And the innovation is necessary. Innovation will not, in 100% of the cases, result immediately in positive outcomes. There will be failures. That's normal. From that we learn. But we need to do it. We need to innovate. So most important, commit. Because through that, you're making yourself responsible towards achieving a just transition goal, and then innovate around it.
Thank you. Alessandra.
Yeah, I feel like there is not much else to add. I mean, I can just echo what the colleagues said, and I think from my perspective, it's really important to give voice to the private sector again, because we need to keep in mind these trillions, right? So if we speak about trillions, that can not only come from the public sector, right? So the public sector should set the stage, which is doing, by the way, and enable the private sector to come in with the critical mass.
Great. Okay, we've covered a lot in this session, and thank you for your participation, and thank you for that conversation. But I think it'd be helpful for the audience if each of you could crystallize a short, memorable insight that you'd like them to take away. Brandon.
Okay, I wrote this down because I
Go on.
remembered we had this bit, and I'd forgotten to prepare for it. So I think this is quite snappy and good. So I think we were all pretty much universally agreed that a just, fair, and inclusive transition is the goal universally, and what that actually means, to answer one of the questions online, will vary depending on sector and geography. I always say, you know, the just transition in Johannesburg is different from the just transition in Belfast. And if we are to do that, we need to see, well, the just transition is a de-risking mechanism for net zero. And I'm going to speak a lot about risk in this final point, which is we de-risk net zero's delivery and make it as efficient as possible, taking consideration of those social risks and opportunities. But also, we need to de-risk the investments right now to kind of mature what constitutes a just transition from an investment point of view. So that means vital roles for DFIs and public finance to de-risk and allow the great, not only impact investors, but more slightly larger, maybe the Schroders, it could even invest alongside more of their capital alongside it as well. So lots of de-risking, I think, is what's needed.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Brendan. Alessandra, key, short, and memorable.
Ooh, no pressure. I'll take it up from the de-risking. So yes, I think it's important to use this blended mechanism, right? So again, I'm looking at my colleague from EBRD. We don't work much together because we focus on different geographies, but really DFIs and DBs, they have a very crucial role to play now, and the private sector would be engaged if there is an active role from DFIs played now. I think that's my take.
Margherita, what will you leave the audience with?
Definitely agree. It's about bringing together the public and the private to achieve a just transition that so that the opportunities that the green economy transition can bring are really shared across for all, and no one is left behind.
Great. Patricia, you get the last word.
Somebody before me already uses the UN slogan, leaving no one behind. What can I still say? I think just very, very briefly, what the panel, at least to me, also showed is this is happening. It's not rocket science. We just need to get our act together and do it. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. And perhaps for me, that is this takeaway that takes away some of the fear or this if you are paralyzed because of a huge amount of work that you think is ahead of you, that you cannot break through, but it's being done, and you can just join the boat. And perhaps that's the takeaway for me. We don't need to reinvent.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the whole discussion. So I'd like to thank the coalition that put together Building Bridges for giving us this opportunity to talk to you about the just transition. I'd like to thank our audience, both here in the room and online, for your engagement, your interest, and your participation. And then can we all just thank this magnificent panel for taking us really into the essence of just transition. Thanks, everybody.